Taking the central spot at the chairman's desk, House Speaker Mike Johnson embodied a profound deviation from standard procedure. Usually, speakers shun leading committee panels, much like top-tier generals avoid marching in the mud with the infantry. Marching into room 2141 with the lethal confidence of an apex predator, Hillary Clinton fully anticipated dismantling a figure she considered nothing more than a participation trophy speaker. However, Mike Johnson quietly locked down all procedural escape routes, discarded the customary political playbook, and unleashed a devastating, inescapable examination of constitutional law that left the prestigious Yale law graduate completely and horrifyingly speechless. The mood inside that colossal chamber of the Rayburn House office building this morning surpassed mere tension. It hummed with the heavy electric dread that always precedes a televised political dismantling, cloaked under the deceptively boring heading of constitutional standards for government records. Instead of a standard posturing congressional inquiry, the event resembled a grueling upper-level law school exam. This calculated pivot was orchestrated by the unassuming chairman who had spent 20 years designing such academic trials long before D.C. ever knew his name. Yet, the battlefield today was strictly constitutional law, the exact arena where Johnson had meticulously sharpened his skills for 2 decades before entering federal office. The Democratic minority's unanimous agreement to let the Speaker preside was a catastrophic, arrogant blunder they would quickly realize as they looked at Hillary Rodham Clinton sitting at the witness table. Positioned at the very same oak table where she had previously bested Senator Kennedy, the underlying atmosphere of the room had shifted, suddenly trapping her in a fatal game ruled by parameters she could not manipulate. Wearing a flawless charcoal suit, rejecting the usual navy or severe black, she adopted the tactical attire of a supreme political survivor who understood the visual psychology of power. While dark colors project commanding dominance and pale tones suggest soft vulnerability, charcoal masterfully controls the room while hiding any hint of vulnerability or intent. Resting on the gleaming wood in front of her were her reading glasses and a solitary pearl pin. These were not functional items, but tactical props kept at hand, similar to a loaded gun casually shown during a high-stakes poker game. Directly across from her, Chairman Johnson was armed with nothing but a standard yellow legal pad, the cheap variety found at any local office supply store. It was the exact humble tool preferred by working-class constitutional lawyers in Shreveport, Louisiana. He chose it for its practical function, and because in those blue-collar areas, flaunting, expensive, personalized stationery isn't seen as a badge of honor, but as an unforgivable flaw to the public, signaling that the trap was flawlessly set and its silent architect was prepared to spring it. Clinton evaluated him with the exact same icy, practiced calculation she had aimed at every interrogator throughout 30 years of inquiries. Her steady gaze belonged to someone perpetually measuring the physical and psychological distance between herself and the nearest credible threat. Having easily brushed off Senator Kennedy's folksy charm to walk away unscathed, stared down hostile Senate committees to emerge victorious, and endured exhausting Benghazi hearings without a scratch, she rapidly processed the dynamic like a supercomputer. She concluded her tactical assessment. The modest man sitting in the chairman's seat presented zero actual threat. To her, he was merely the greenest House Speaker in over a century. He was just the turbulent Republican Party's fourth choice, a fluke leader no one actually wanted for the role. He was a small-town constitutional lawyer from Shreveport with no Supreme Court appearances, no elite federal clerkships, and no background at the prestigious East Coast law firms respected by the D.C. elite. When she opened her mouth, her tone dripped with the condescending focus of an apex predator toying with its meal. Mr. Speaker, with all due respect, and I mean that genuinely, "You are the most inexperienced speaker in 140 years," she pronounced. Her statement reverberated through the hushed room, heavy with the crushing authority of someone who had spent her whole life dominating rooms where raw experience was the only currency, and she had exponentially more of it than anyone else there. "You have served in Congress for less time than I spent merely as Secretary of State," she pressed on, her gaze fixed on him. "You practiced law in Shreveport. I practiced law at the Yale Law Clinic, at the Children's Defense Fund, at the Rose Law Firm, and within the White House counsel's sphere," she cataloged. She deployed a calculated pause, not to catch her breath, but as a weaponized quiet engineered for maximum dramatic effect. Clinton's iconic pauses were tuned with the exactness of a smart bomb set to explode at a precise coordinate with a specific blast radius. "Before you attempt to school me on constitutional standards, maybe remember that some of us have been utilizing them at the absolute highest echelons of government while you were submitting paperwork in Bossier Parish," she declared. She wasn't done turning the blade. "And I will point out that your primary credential for the speakership was not your capability. It was that absolutely no one else desired the position. You were the fourth option, Mr. Speaker. The participation trophy speaker." The whole committee room physically jolted as the collective breath of 200 attendees lodged in their throats. A low electric buzz rolled through the audience while Clinton's top aide, a crisply dressed Georgetown MBA sitting just behind her, began frantically tapping on a tablet. The jab was surgically exact, heavily workshopped, and built to immediately establish an ironclad hierarchy. The dominance of Yale over LSU, Washington's urban elite over Shreveport's rural simplicity, a Secretary of State's international power over a local constitutional attorney, and the bulletproof shield of veteran experience against perceived amateurism. Up at the raised chairman's dais, Mike Johnson responded in a manner that absolutely nobody in that massive space predicted. He didn't turn red with fury or smash his gavel to demand silence. He merely retrieved a cheap plastic pen, took the cap off with agonizing slowness, and jotted precisely 2 words onto his yellow legal pad. Then he raised his eyes to Hillary Clinton, wearing the tranquil face of a grandmaster in chess who had just been gifted the exact opening move needed to pull off a flawless checkmate, because in her staggering arrogance, Clinton had just committed a disastrous blunder, a highly technical, profoundly strategic failure of legal framing that only a veteran constitutional lawyer would instantly spot and leverage. In her rush to publicly embarrass him, she had fiercely targeted his background, while simultaneously entering her own gold-plated curriculum vitae into the permanent congressional record. She had specifically named Yale, the Rose Law Firm, the Children's Defense Fund, and her time as Secretary of State. She had drawn a harsh, distinct boundary between Shreveport and Washington, between LSU and Yale, and between Bossier Parish and the global arena. And by doing that, she had cemented on camera for the enduring historical archive, entirely of her own volition, that she was undeniably one of the most legally trained individuals in the United States. This signified, according to the ironclad rules of legal combat, that every single complicated constitutional query Johnson was preparing to throw at her was one she now had zero acceptable justification for failing to answer flawlessly. She had confidently strutted into the testing center, loudly broadcasted to the entire room that she was the most intelligent person there, and the unassuming instructor seated opposite her was now exceedingly eager to distribute the exam. Madam Secretary Johnson commenced, and his tone was a revelation, devoid of pointless shouting or weak hesitation. It wasn't dripping with fake Southern charm or laced with partisan toxicity. It was the chillingly composed voice of an individual who had stood before university lecture halls for 2 decades and discovered that the most commanding noise a veteran teacher can produce is the profound resonance of endless patience, I appreciate the resume. It is formidable. Yale Law, 1973. Rose Law Firm, Children's Defense Fund, Secretary of State. I recorded it all, he conceded. With a fluid, rehearsed sweep, he lifted the yellow legal pad and angled it outward so she and the gathered media could clearly see it. Two words stood out sharply, penned in the massive, undeniable block letters of a lawyer who had written dense legal arguments by hand for over 20 years. Pop quiz. Since you have refreshed my memory regarding your credentials, Madam Secretary, I would like to evaluate them. 5 inquiries, constitutional law, the precise variety I used to administer to freshmen at Liberty University, he suggested. He placed the yellow pad softly back onto the desk. I am certain a Yale Law alum will find them quite elementary, he remarked. He allowed his eyes to scan the hushed committee panel, then locked his gaze resolutely back onto Clinton and issued the phrase that would rapidly transform into the unavoidable, rhythmic pulse of the subsequent 30 minutes, the phrase that tens of millions of citizens streaming the live feed at home would quickly learn to recognize as the terrifying audio cue of the next crushing strike. Let me walk you through the first question, he announced. Let me walk you through the first question, Johnson reiterated, his tone locking into a mesmerizing academic cadence that the paralyzed hearing room would come to intimately know over the next half hour. It was the unhurried pace of an expert educator who has given this exact lesson thousands of times and knows exactly where the intellectual pitfalls are buried, because the challenging sections are always exactly where the pupils abruptly fall silent. 18 U.S.C. Section 2071, the Federal Records Act. Madam Secretary, you examined this thoroughly at Yale. You implemented it every day at the State Department. So here is my inquiry, the type I used to pose to first-year undergrads who skipped the required reading. Except I am aware you completed the reading because you lived through it. He structured the prompt. He peered down at her, not with hostile prosecutorial aggression, but with an objective, clinical fascination. It was the precise expression a professor shoots a trapped student moments before asking a question the educator already knows the student has the capacity to answer. According to 18 U.S.C. Section 2071, what is the specific punishment for the intentional hiding, extraction, or annihilation of federal records, he inquired. The cavernous hearing room immediately descended into a choking quiet. It was not the dramatic silence that typically trails a lawmaker's snappy comeback. It was a substantially different, denser silence. It was the raw, physical silence of 200 individuals, all realizing at once that the speaker's inquiry was not theoretical, and it was not a grandstanding media clip. Johnson was genuinely anticipating a response, waiting with the frightening endurance of a tenured academic who has thrown a fundamental concept at a floundering classroom, standing mute with the total comprehension that the agonizing quiet itself is an essential component of the learning mechanism. Clinton's gaze flicked downward, but significantly not toward her exhaustively organized briefing folders. Instead, her eyes glued themselves to the empty expanse of the witness desk, concentrating intensely on her own 2 hands lying flat on the smooth oak. It was the universal, involuntary bodily reaction of a pupil who possesses the right answer with total conviction, but also understands that speaking that answer aloud will trigger massive self-inflicted damage. Her lips sealed firmly together, utterly deleting the renowned, radiant political grin that had adorned thousands of magazine covers. That grin was an instrument of mass PR, and this was definitively not a situation where those instruments held any value. Her lips were sealed so firmly they blanched white, an automatic physical wall raised to hold the destructive words locked inside, very much like one forcefully pushes a heavy lid down on a scalding pot to stop the toxic material from overflowing. She possessed the answer, and every single lawyer, staff member, and reporter in that space who had ever stepped inside a legal academy knew exactly what she knew. The statutory answer was a maximum of 3 years in prison, but the secondary consequence, the element that carried infinitely more weight to a political empire, was permanent, barring from occupying any office under the United States government. If she parted her lips and voiced the law, she would be voluntarily reading her own potential criminal penalty on live television. She opted for the silence, letting 3 torturous seconds pass, then 4, then 5. Johnson ultimately nodded with the deliberate, understanding motion of a veteran teacher who has just observed a gifted student intentionally leave a vital test question blank and profoundly grasps the fearful logic as to why. "I will answer it for you, Madam Secretary." His tone stayed incredibly soft, holding an almost crushing warmth, the specific brand of warmth an educator uses when sadly handing a failing mark to a pupil who had all the natural ability to succeed but merely declined to put in the effort. The penalty is up to 3 years behind bars and permanent disqualification from holding any office under the United States. He let the suffocating pressure of the federal code hang motionless in the silent atmosphere of the chamber. You were aware of that? You were absolutely certain of it when you commanded the installation of a private, unprotected email server in the basement of your private home in Chappaqua. You were aware of it when your IT staff deployed BleachBit, a military-grade data wiping application to irrevocably erase 33,000 subpoenaed records from existence. And you knew it exceptionally well when a reporter questioned you regarding wiping the server, and you smirked for the cameras and remarked to the American public, "What, like with a cloth?" Johnson halted, allowing the ghost of her notorious quip to permeate the space. Senator Kennedy questioned you regarding that exact statement. He opted to make it humorous, referencing Boudreaux and the fishing trip and the rag. It was a solid, catchy broadcast moment, but I am not going to make it humorous today, Madam Secretary, because there was absolutely nothing humorous about it. It was a Yale law alum, intentionally feigning ignorance of a core federal law she had completely memorized during her initial semester of legal training. That was not authentic bewilderment. It was a premeditated, cynical act, he reprimanded. And the target demographic for that act was the American public. And honestly, they merited much better than cheap theatrics from an individual who lifted their right hand and took a holy oath to represent them. He summarized. He peacefully placed his pen down on the wood, and the absolute physical energy of the room altered. What followed was not another sterile legal probe, but intensely, viscerally intimate, and the committee chamber absorbed the seismic change, not in the volume of his voice, which stayed anchored at the exact same tolerant pitch, but completely in his posture. He tilted back marginally in the large leather seat, dropping the stiff framing of a prosecutor and taking on the relaxed framing of a man getting ready to speak, not as a legal expert, but as a mourning child. My father served as a firefighter in Shreveport, Louisiana, Engine Company 10. On November 3rd, 1984, he rushed to a catastrophic structural blaze on Linwood Avenue. It was an industrial warehouse. The structure was completely engulfed by the time his truck pulled up to the location. Fire was bursting through the caving roof, and the dense, dark smoke could be seen from 3 streets away. His closest companion and brother-in-arms, a courageous guy named Russell, was already stuck indoors. Johnson detailed, his unwavering tone did not shake or melt into cheap melodrama for the broadcast. It stayed terrifyingly flat, the hardened flatness of an individual who had relayed this traumatic tale so many times. He had systematically scorched all the raw feeling out of the narrative, leaving behind just the bare facts, which were intrinsically more devastating than any theatrical emotion could ever communicate. The structure collapsed. Russell perished inside the blaze. My father suffered severe burns across 40% of his physique. He endured 8 torturous months residing inside a burn trauma center, skin grafts, 17 in total. 17 distinct times, a trauma physician had to literally slice healthy skin from an untouched area of his body and sew it onto the exposed flesh of another. He was 32. My mom was 29. I was 12 at the time. My 3 younger siblings were 10, 7, and 4, he recounted. He paused, letting the bleak reality sink in among the political aristocrats in the chamber. This break was not for dramatic flair. It was for absolute precision, because the upcoming segment was the segment that counted. He never worked a solitary day again as a first responder. Not because he lacked the drive. He tried fiercely on 2 occasions. Once, he tried an administrative role, but his spine simply could not tolerate sitting in a seat for beyond an hour because the massive skin graft stretching across his lower back had not healed properly, and the physicians informed him they never would. He attempted it again at a hazardous materials consulting position, which he obstinately forced himself to maintain for a couple of years until his ruined body eventually just refused. Thus, he started a charitable organization, the Percy R. Johnson Burn Foundation, he went on, because he rationalized that if his physical form would not allow him to battle fires anymore, he could at minimum commit his life to instructing other junior firefighters on how to endure them. He managed that charity entirely from our simple living room, occupying a specialized chair fitted with extra medical-grade foam because standard seating felt like shattered glass against his grafts. He lived out the rest of his days in that seat, he illustrated. Johnson's tone kept its relentless rhythm. Authentic suffering, Madam Secretary. The variety of unyielding suffering where you literally cannot rest at night because the simple rubbing of linens against the grafts feels like a blazing inferno, and the grafts have not recovered, and they will never completely recover. The sort of profound mental trauma where your 12-year-old boy has to rapidly learn not to embrace you too tightly when he arrives home from class. Because a standard kid's hug on massively scarred tissue is not a wellspring of solace. It is an act of injury. I was forced to learn that brutal reality, he conveyed. At 12 years of age, the majority of children learn to embrace their folks softly because they are courteously instructed to do so by grown-ups. I learned to embrace softly because I literally watched my idol of a dad recoil in sheer agony when I made contact with him, he clarified. He fastened his gaze onto Clinton's, and the oxygen in the space vanished. My dad swore an oath, Madam Secretary. It was not the precise same pledge that you swore. Firefighters pledge a holy obligation to safeguard lives and real estate, not expressly to uphold and protect the United States Constitution, but the fundamental ethical foundation is entirely the same. When you swear a grave oath, you do not receive the privilege of choosing which exact sections pertain to you on any specific day. You do not get to handpick which blazing structures you are prepared to sprint into, and you absolutely do not get to covertly construct a hidden escape hatch for yourself before you ever, he pronounced, step through the main entrance, his stare cutting through her rehearsed exterior. My dad voluntarily sprinted directly into a falling warehouse on Linwood Avenue exclusively because that is precisely what his pledge demanded of him in that horrific instant. He did not halt to review the survey metrics to determine if the structure was politically advantageous to rescue. He did not pause to compute if charging into the inferno would tactically benefit his subsequent professional trajectory. He just charged directly through the front entrance, and passing through that front entrance cost him his physical health. He relayed. Johnson looked unforgivingly at the ex-Secretary of State, and now his tone bore an entirely fresh vibration. It was not the fury of partisan rage, nor the theatrical grief of a casualty. It was the crushing lucidity of an ethical contrast that needed no extra clarification for the masses tuning in from their living rooms. You swore an oath as well, Madam Secretary. Every new Secretary of State lifts their right hand before the Almighty and pledges to uphold and protect the Constitution of the United States. You openly swore that pledge, and afterward, instantly, you methodically engineered an escape hatch. You built a personal server. You devised a private, undocumented digital messaging framework. You established a hidden communication web expressly intended to execute the crucial affairs of the American citizenry in the shadows, precisely where the citizenry could never lawfully observe it. My dad profoundly respected his pledge, and it cost him quite literally everything he possessed. You, he charged, deliberately shattered yours, and up to this point, it has cost you absolutely zero, he condemned. Clinton's head, which had been dipping in a soft mechanical cadence, the rehearsed bobbing that any politically conditioned individual utilizes when compelled to hear a tragic anecdote regarding a public servant's martyrdom, suddenly halted. It froze midway, suspended uncomfortably halfway between an empathetic dip and a blank glare, freezing into an unnatural bodily stance that held no formal title in the political manual, because it was the immobilized stance of a person trapped in a mental crossfire between two instincts that could no longer exist together. If she kept dipping her head, she was visually conceding on national TV that she had shattered her constitutional pledge. If she ceased dipping completely, she was admitting that she absorbed the crushing parallel between herself and his disabled dad and was purposely opting to dismiss it. She stayed entirely motionless, her face angled 2 degrees downward, forever trapped in the excruciating chasm between courteous manners and explicit legal admission. Gradually, her left hand lifted from the wooden desk and floated toward her throat, her fingertips softly grazing the solitary pearl pin attached at her neckline. She was not fixing the accessory. She was simply grazing it, outlining its polished curve the exact way a panicked individual frantically strokes a prayer bead when every other fragment of stable earth has been brutally torn away. It was a classic, primitive display of self-comfort. And C-SPAN's camera 2 captured the whole micro-reaction in excruciating close-up. It was the gripping visual of arguably the most influential woman in American governmental lore, blindly grasping for a trinket in the exact same frantic fashion a terrified toddler grasps for a comfort blanket. Let me walk you through the next question, the sentence echoing back as an unavoidable metronomic beat. It had swiftly evolved into Johnson's defining signal, acting in the same mental capacity as Senator Kennedy's folksy wiping of his spectacles or Tulsi Gabbard's theatrical unveiling of a binder. Johnson's signal was the steady sentence of an academic starting the next devastating section of a complex syllabus, 5 USC section 552, the Freedom of Information Act, globally recognized as FOIA, enacted into law by President Lyndon Johnson in 1966. No familial connection, he specified. A bone-dry smirk momentarily graced the edges of Johnson's lips, the solitary trace of amusement the speaker would exhibit the entire session, dissipating before the lenses could adequately capture it. FOIA exists because the architects of this republic profoundly trusted in a central doctrine that the state ultimately belongs to the populace and never the reverse. They trusted that the citizenry hold an undeniable right to observe precisely what the state is executing on their behalf, he explained. He directed a glare that felt tangible in its ferocity. When you intentionally established an undocumented email network, you didn't just breach an archiving regulation, you haughtily flipped the entire core dynamic between the individual and the government. You unilaterally concluded that the American populace are your employees. You concluded that the citizenry's fundamental right to transparency stretches only as far as you individually permit it to stretch. That is not a technical administration problem, Madam Secretary. That is a massive constitutional problem. It is the core distinction between acting as a civic employee and reigning as an absolute king, and the Constitution is incredibly explicit regarding exactly, he declared. which one you are supposed to represent? He concluded, flipping a sheet on his yellow notebook. Let me offer you a highly detailed illustration. In the wake of the catastrophic 2010 seismic event in Haiti, the global collective pledged $4.4 billion to reconstruct the nation. The Clinton Foundation actively maneuvered itself to assume a pivotal part in allocating those funds. At that exact same moment, you were acting as the Secretary of State, the exclusive authority, green-lighting foreign relief distributions. At the same time, your spouse was acting as the UN Special Envoy to Haiti, rendering him the principal authority managing global rebuilding efforts. And simultaneously, the Clinton Foundation was taking in hidden contributions from commercial firms pursuing rebuilding agreements. 3, he mapped out colossal international positions. One solitary household, $4.4 billion. He stopped, allowing the pure scale of the figure to resonate. The tangible outcome? Precisely 6 permanent residences were built. $4.4 billion, and Haiti received 6 residences from it. A catfish breeder running a business out of Breaux Bridge, Louisiana, yields a higher return on his capital. But that belongs to Senator Kennedy, and I will not pilfer it, he commented. A weak, anxious flutter of chuckles drifted across the room, but Johnson ignored it immediately, precisely like a dialed-in instructor bypassing a student's gag because pausing ruins the flow of the lecture. What I will declare is this. When desperate Haitian nationals lawfully submitted FOIA petitions to attempt to comprehend how these vital relief choices were being finalized, how agreements were granted, and why $4.4 billion magically generated just 6 permanent dwellings next to a premium vacation resort, those petitions struck a solid wall he laid bare. And the reason? Because the messages holding those determinations were not located in the formal State Department records. They were resting on a machine in your lower level in Chappaqua, New York. Wedged flawlessly between your boiler and your holiday ornaments, he uncovered. He allowed the ridiculous, degrading picture to rest heavily in the consciousness of the viewers. Somewhere in Chappaqua, in the lower level of a residence possessed by a former commander-in-chief and a former secretary of state, a machine holding the critical relief files of the most impoverished country in the Western Hemisphere rested gathering dust adjacent to festive decorations. And the agonizing citizens of Haiti, who had just suffered 316,000 casualties in the seismic event, were unable to review their own files because those records were unlawfully categorized under personal communications in a framework engineered to be untouchable by the statute that secured their entitlement to touch it. The populace of Haiti could not review their own critically required relief files simply because, he detailed, you concluded those files belong to you. A constitutional attorney down in Shreveport would label that the sabotage of the democratic process. What would a Yale law alum label it, Madam Secretary? He provoked. Clinton overtly shifted, executing not a graceful pivot, but a massive, frantic, whole-body rotation. Her upper body twisted sharply toward her lead assistant, her eyes dilated, desperately scanning the younger individual's expression, and her jaw fell open half an inch, frantically shaping the starting sounds of a panicked inquiry. She would not vocalize out loud, mostly because begging your employee for assistance on live TV is the political equivalent of phoning a lifeline on a trivia show. The assistant, the Georgetown grad, stared back at her superior, and her expression instantly communicated a devastating reality through 2 mute gestures. First, her eyes expanded marginally, broadcasting alarm, and second, she executed a shake of the head so microscopically small it was practically invisible. The unspoken communication was absolute. I possess nothing for you. There was no document in the prep binder that addressed why were Haitian parents blocked from reading their own relief documents. There was no spin for that. no deflection, so Clinton sluggishly rotated back. The first panicked rotation away had consumed precisely 1 second rapid, fueled by the rush of pure optimism, but the torturous rotation back consumed 3 entire seconds, sluggish, empty-handed, shifting at the beaten velocity of an individual who grasped and secured 0. The physical disparity in pace between those two distinct gestures was the physical manifestation of total defeat, and the committee chamber witnessed it. Let me walk you through the regulations on restricted data, he pivoted. Johnson fluidly grabbed his pen and sketched a bold horizontal line directly across his yellow legal pad, splitting the paper in half. On the left half, he penned 2 terms, and on the right half, 2 additional ones. He elevated the pad, displaying it prominently for the lenses. Left side, extremely careless. Right side, grossly negligent. 18 U.S.C. Section 793F forbids gross negligence in the management of national security data. 110 messages on your unprotected machine held restricted data. 8 message threads were classified at the top secret SAP tier special access programs, the supreme restriction level in the American government. Data so critical that even its project titles are restricted. Data that lifelong espionage operatives review in custom-built chambers titled SCIFs chambers, where mobile devices are seized. Glass panes are non-existent, and barriers are constructed to thwart electronic monitoring. He educated. He paused, then appended. You viewed that exact data on a machine that shared a lower level with your boiler, a machine managed not by the National Security Agency, but by a commercial tech vendor from Colorado who possessed no clearance level at the time of his starting labor on the network. Johnson pointed to the left portion of the line. FBI Director James Comey, who advised against indictment, characterized your behavior as extremely careless. He pointed to the right portion. Grossly negligent is the legal phrasing that initiates criminal accountability. He positioned the pad between the 2 terms. In 2 decades of practicing constitutional law, Madam Secretary, I have discovered that the gap between extremely careless and grossly negligent is the gap between a parking fine and a serious crime. The terms sound alike. The outcomes are not. One earns you a penalty fee, the other earns you a jail cell. And in this instance, the FBI director examined the proof, 110 restricted messages, 8 top secret threads, bleach bit, a personal machine in a basement, and determined it was a parking fine. He placed the pad down, declaring, "You drove away," when an abrupt noise emerged from Clinton. Brief, reflexive, pushed through the nasal cavity. A chuckle, but not the rehearsed giggle of 1,000 gala banquets. An authentic chuckle, the short, instinctual chuckle of an attorney who has just witnessed a legal point so flawlessly built that the artisan within her cannot help but admire it, even while the point is being utilized to skin her alive. Parking fine versus serious crime was brilliant, and she recognized it was brilliant. Her Stanford undergraduate and Yale legal education had conditioned her to acknowledge brilliant legal framing automatically, irrespective of whether it is working for you or against you. But the chuckle perished immediately because she spotted the crimson bulb on camera 1 and comprehended in the split of a second that she had just chuckled regarding restricted messages on live TV. Her expression locked down, not slowly, but entirely at once, like blinds slamming over a pane. From chuckle to blank in under a second, the shift was so rapid it appeared robotic, unnatural, like observing someone flick off a switch. And the unnaturalness of that shift would turn into the viral moment, not the chuckle itself, but the assassination of the chuckle. The obvious instant when Hillary Clinton's expression shifted from authentic human emotion to a political facade in 0.8 seconds. Her assistant pushed a slip of paper across the desk, which Clinton scanned but declined to utilize. The note read, "Assert executive privilege But executive privilege does not pertain to a civilian answering questions before a legislative panel, and Clinton was aware of that. The slip was the maneuver of an individual who had exhausted their options, but still required the appearance of taking action. Johnson proceeded, his tone unaltered, persisting in teaching the way educators persist when a pupil creates a disruption. Senator Grassley has uncovered that the FBI never finished its audit of all flash drives holding duplicates of your messages. In 2025, there are drives that have never been accessed. A constitutional attorney would label that a defective probe. A freshman undergrad would label it obstruction via stalling. I will allow the American populace to determine what to label it, he commented. Final question, Madam Secretary, Johnson stated, flipping to a clean sheet on the legal pad. The yellow sheets that had been flipped were visible records, a visual log of the test, 5 inquiries, 5 tenets of constitutional law. Article 1, Sections 2 and 3 of the Constitution bestow upon Congress the authority of oversight concerning the executive branch. That authority contains the power to issue subpoenas and retention directives for state documents. Lacking this authority, Congress is unable to execute its constitutional duty. Lacking this authority, the executive branch functions devoid of oversight. The framers comprehended that authority devoid of oversight is dictatorship. That is not my perspective. That is Federalist 51, he lectured. He gazed at Clinton, proposing, "Let me walk you through a chronology." The sentence echoed, but this instance it possessed a distinct gravity. This was a progression of dates, and dates do not debate. They merely rest there in sequence and inform you of what occurred. March 4th, 2015. The House Select Committee on Benghazi delivered a subpoena for your records. Concurrently, a retention directive was issued demanding that all pertinent files be kept, he pointed out. He scribbled on the pad, March 4th, March 25th through March 31st, 2015. Your IT staff deployed BleachBit to irrevocably obliterate messages on the personal machine, he logged. He scribbled, March 25th to 31st, and he sketched an arrow connecting the 2 days, 21 days, separating the directive to retain and the choice to obliterate. 3 weeks, he emphasized, staring at the lenses. This subsequent portion was not for Clinton. It was for the 40 million citizens tuning in from their living rooms who had never encountered the term spoliation. In constitutional law, we possess a term for obliterating material after a retention directive has been issued. The term is spoliation. I am going to clarify what that signifies because they do not broadcast it on cable television, he explained. He raised the pad. Spoliation activates what attorneys term an adverse inference. Here is what that signifies in simple English. When an individual obliterates material after being instructed to save it, the legal system assumes that whatever was obliterated was detrimental to the individual who obliterated it. The onus of proof reverses. You are not required to demonstrate the material was damaging. The individual who obliterated it must demonstrate it was not. He placed the pad down, finalizing, if you erase a mobile message after a magistrate instructs you to save it, the tribunal presumes the message was detrimental to you. That is the rule for every citizen in every tribunal. He gazed at Clinton, hammering the concept home. 33,000 messages erased 3 weeks after the legislature demanded they be kept. That is spoliation. That is an adverse inference. That is the justice system declaring, we are unaware of what resided in those messages, but we are aware you obliterated them when instructed otherwise. Therefore, we are going to presume the most damaging scenario. That is not an interpretation. That is absolute legal doctrine instructed at Yale. Clinton's right hand, motionless for 25 minutes, shifted toward the water tumbler, a path recognized from the Kennedy inquiry when she utilized the tumbler as a stalling maneuver. The hand halted 2 inches away from the tumbler, suspending, because reaching for the tumbler at this moment was reaching for a tactic already revealed. She realized halfway through the motion that she was on the verge of committing the exact same error twice. The hand rested, suspended between hydration and tactics. Comprehending everything her physical form could execute had already been deciphered by the viewers. She dropped her hand flat onto the desk. An individual who had concluded taking no action was the least terrible alternative available, which is not a choice anybody makes while succeeding. Johnson stood up, not dramatically, but to clearly signal the lesson's absolute end. Recapping his 5 constitutional inquiries regarding records, oaths, FOIA, classified data, and oversight, he noted that her elite Yale education taught her the law perfectly. However, she deliberately bypassed the framers' established safeguards, arrogantly believing they simply did not apply to her. Johnson masterfully flipped her opening insult, stating the true distance between Shreveport and Yale is the massive gap between honoring the law and learning the law merely to subvert it. Since she deemed the examination completely beneath her, her 5 unanswered questions earned much worse than a failing grade. He then delivered a final unanswerable query. If the Constitution does not apply to a former Secretary of State, who does it actually apply to? 10 agonizing seconds of suffocating silence followed. Clinton's mouth opened slightly, but shut again, realizing any possible response would either openly defy the Constitution or weakly beg for leniency. The Constitution offers no grading curve, so she remained entirely mute. Quietly, Johnson contrasted her actions with his father, who sacrificed his body for his oath, whereas she treated her sacred pledge like a casual suggestion. Striking the heavy gavel once, he adjourned the intense session, permanently cementing her irrevocable failure into the official congressional record. The immediate public aftermath was explosive, triggered by a viral short clip of Clinton's face snapping from a genuine chuckle into a cold, calculated political mask. This chilling transition accumulated over 34 million views in just 3 days and birthed a massive TikTok trend as the nation finally witnessed the authentic facade slipping. A Stanford psychologist labeled it effective override, but the impending legal blows were far heavier. A federal judge issued an unprecedented adverse inference order, legally presuming her destroyed private records were inherently damaging. Simultaneously, the FBI was mandated to crack open unexamined drives containing top-secret files, prompting the DOJ to quickly expand their probe into the massive Haiti relief disaster. Following Elon Musk's public criticism of her deliberate evidence destruction, the IRS formally audited the Clinton Foundation. The compounding scandal cost Clinton her prestigious Georgetown commencement address and a massive $3 million literary book deal. Ironically, Yale Law School integrated the hearing into their ethics curriculum, while the contrast was broadcast across highway billboards. You just watched an unassuming constitutional attorney completely dismantle a political titan. Her deafening silence confirmed the test is conclusively over and her failing grade is permanently archived. Senator Grassley is currently preparing to open those restricted drives. The final true verdict ultimately belongs entirely to you. What dark secrets terrified the DOJ, and what hidden names destroyed her lucrative literary contract? Washington's elite are absolutely terrified of the massive impending fallout. Smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because our next exclusive and explosive deep dive investigation into Grassley's flash drives will shake the political capital to its very core. You absolutely do not want to miss a single second of this broadcast.